And thank you all for coming. Tonight we are going back in time to 1935 when two crimes shocked and engaged the nation. Even today they are important because of what they tell us about the changing nature of crime and detection in the 1930s, and about society in general at a time of great political upheaval. Much has changed in the past 86 years, but much remains the same, and the Ruxin Murders and the Cuddies crimes can help put this in perspective. Tonight we are joined by two authors who have studied the Ruxton and the Cuddies crimes in great detail, and they will help us to shine light on these tragic events. Tom Wood is a former Deputy Chief Constable of Lothian and Borders Police and spent his entire career working in the police service. He is the author of Ruxton, the First Modern Murder for Ringwood Publishing. Rob McInroy is a novelist and a short story writer who writes about his native Perthshire and who used the true crimes on the Cuddies Strip on the outskirts of Perth as the basis of his first novel for Ringwood Publishing, Cuddies Strip. Welcome to both of you. Sarah will be asking our authors some questions about Cuddies Strip and Ruxton, and I will be monitoring the Q&A box to ask any audience questions. The box is at the bottom of the screen if you have any questions.
Great, thank you, Bianca. So firstly, I think we could talk a bit about both of your writing processes, because although you've both written books based on true crime events in 1935, the way you've written them is quite different. So Tom, you've taken the Ruxin Murders and written about them as non-fiction, while Rob, you've turned the Cuddies Strip crimes into fiction. So maybe to start us off, I could ask you both to give us an introduction to your books and why you took the approaches you did to them. We can start with Tom.
Thank you very much. Well, the Ruxin Murders were probably one of the most important murders in 20th century British criminal history. Not because of the murders themselves, or because of the brilliant investigation that went on, which I'll tell you about later, but because of the changes they brought about. 1935 was a tipping point in criminal investigation. And when you look at the way that crimes were investigated before 1935, it's almost like going back to the Middle Ages. 1935 and the Ruxton case brought us into the modern era. Now, I knew all about the Ruxton case as a detective training and forensic studies. You learn about the Ruxton case, but a few years before I left the police service, I was given a package of papers, old documents from a long dead detective who had worked on the case. And that showed an entirely different aspect to the investigation. And I was fascinated by it. I'd done quite a lot of cold case investigations. And so this was like a cold case. I took a look back using my own experience and 21st century eyes into an early 20th century case. Why did I take the approach I did? I think that writing crime fact and crime fiction are very different. And I'm not sure, frankly, whether I'd be very good at writing fictional work, coming from the background I do. But in any event, fact is often stranger than fiction. And that I think the proof of that is the fact that how many fictional cases are actually based on real crimes, either loosely or exactly. So history is very partial, and what you find when you look at true crime through a historical perspective, you find that some people have been written out of the script, some people have been remembered for the wrong things. There's a whole subset of interesting facts lying below the surface which have not been reported. And what I enjoyed doing in this case was drawing some of these forgotten people out into the light again and showing the remarkable job they had done way back in 1935. Now, on one hand, the Ruxton case is very simple. It's a domestic murder. Bella Ruxton was married to a very exotic doctor, Dr. Buck Ruxton. He was a French Indian. She was a socialite, and they had a very tempestuous marriage, and it ended up with her being killed in what was a classic domestic murder. Unfortunately, their little servant girl, Mary Rogerson, who just so happened to be there, she got caught up and she was killed too. Now, so far, so unfortunately, tragically normal. What happened after that was abnormal. Ruxton was a surgeon of some consequence, very experienced surgeon, and he dismembered the bodies, allowed them to decompose, and then scattered them all over the borders of Scotland, 100 miles from Lancaster, where the crimes took place. What happened after that was the most remarkable work by forensic scientists and police officers to piece these body parts together using completely new techniques and finally prove a case against Buck Ruxton, and Ruxton was hanged. The case caused such a furore, and there was so much prestige attached to the techniques that it actually forced all police forces to adopt modern forensic techniques. And that's why it's such an important case.
Oh, that's really interesting. Thank you. I like what you said about fact being stranger than fiction. There's some events in Ruxton that definitely come to mind for me for that. Like there's an incident, if you end up reading it, anyone, where there's like a bicyclist that Ruxton nearly hits on his drive. And it's a kind of coincidence that will then later lead to his conviction. It's a kind of thing that in a novel you might think was too coincidental, but in life it really happened. So that's really interesting. And Rob, what about you?
Yeah, okay. I'll give a bit of background first of all about what Cuddies strip is. So it's August 1935, and Danny Kerrigan, who's 18 years old, and Marjorie Fenwick, who's 17 years old, are walking on the Cuddies strip, which is a lover's lane on the outskirts of Perth. It's a full moon, it's 10 in the evening, but it's still very warm because it's been hot sunshine all day. And they're walking hand in hand back towards Perth. But in an instant, everything changes. A gunshot rings out and Danny collapses to the ground, dead. Terrified, Marjorie runs back towards Perth, but she hears footsteps behind her. And she tries to cross a stile to get to the Buckie Braes, but she's caught and she's dragged into a field and she's stripped naked and she's raped. And she's left there injured but alive. And what she doesn't realise is that really this is only the start of her ordeal. So the Cuddies strip is a fictionalised account of those true crimes that happened in Perth in 1935. And the novel follows the investigation, which is led by Chief Inspector Victor Connerboy and PC Bob Kelty. And I think it's probably fair to say that they struggle as much with their colleagues in the case as they do with the complexities of the investigation. And so it becomes a race against time for them to catch the culprit before he can strike again. And the novel also follows the experience of Marjorie, the poor young woman who I said her ordeal was just beginning, because her testimony and even her character are shockingly called into question by the authorities. So the novel, it examines the mores of that time and that society, and it tries to explore what it was like to be a woman in a very male-dominated society. And so as to why I wrote it as fiction, well, I mean, the first and obvious answer is that I am a fiction writer, and that's what I've always done, and that's what particularly interests me. And I think fiction's a wonderful way to try and understand the real world, what's going on around us, to understand the dilemmas, examine the dilemmas that people go through, get inside their heads, look at what they think, look at what their actions are, what the repercussions might be for them and for everybody around them. So it's a really powerful way, I think, of looking at issues. And when I first came across the story, it was Marjorie's treatment that really struck me. And I just felt so strongly for this poor young woman. I needed to write about it. I was in the middle of writing a trilogy at this point. I'd written one novel and there was 20,000 words into the second one. But I realized I had to put them to one side for the time being and write this story. And I realized I could do that best as fiction. In terms of what research I had all the newspaper articles from the time, and they gave a really detailed account of what happened, much more than current modern day newspapers, particularly when it came to the trial. They went into the trial in tremendous detail. And I also had access to the court materials, which are held in the National Records of Scotland in Edinburgh. What I didn't have was the police papers in relation to it. They're stored in the Perth and Kinross Council archives, and they've been embargoed for 100 years. So nobody will get to look at them for another 14, 15 years. So unlike Tom, I didn't have access to all the information on the actual investigation. But what I did have was this story about this young woman who was trapped in a judicial system that really treated her fairly appallingly. And it just made sense for me as a fiction writer to write this as a piece of fiction and to use it to try and explore the impact on Marjorie of what happened.
Yeah, I can see why that would make sense to do it that way. Like such a tragic story, but almost using fiction to do that helps you kind of explore more what would happen to her character and how she would feel in that situation. And I think I'm right in saying that both crimes generated a lot of publicity and interest at the time.
Yeah, they did. If I can just share my screen for a moment. Right, and so can you see that?
Yeah.
Right. Yes, it did. There was a lot of publicity, and actually, by coincidence, the two cases came to trial at much the same time in November of 1935. So you can see this is the Sunday Post, the biggest selling newspaper in the world at that time. And it was talking, this is in center pages, 2 big murder cases this week. So it's talking about the Bucky Braes tragedy, that's the Cuddies strip, and the Muffet Ravine discovery, that's Ruxton. And you can see some of the officers involved. So on the left, that's Gordon Leith, who's actually from Glasgow City Police, but he worked on the Cuddies strip case. And the other 2 officers worked on the Ruxton case. So you can see quite a lot of stuff there on it. There's also, I'll just mention this because this is one of the occupational hazards you have of being a researcher. When you're looking at all of these old newspapers, you see headlines like that, eels hold up traffic. And you've just got to explore that. You've got to read on and find out how they did it. So that's one that probably lost me another 20 minutes of my research time. You have to do it. So that was on the inside pages of the Sunday Post. This was the front page of the Sunday Post that day before the trial started. And these are some of the women involved. So on the left, that's Marjorie from Cuddies strip. And in the middle, this is the woman who found the dismembered bodies in the Ruxton case. And on the right, we've got Miss Hunter, who worked with the Ruxton family at one point. So the Sunday Post obviously highlighting these women on their front page. Now, when it came to trial, they picked up on it, and you can see both cases side by side in the newspapers and getting probably equal column inches in terms of what they were writing about. So for the Ruxton case, the identification of the bodies, and for the Perth murder trial, basically the identification of the culprit, because McGuigan is the man who was eventually charged with the crime. So you can see a lot of information on it there. And we have yet another one of those interesting asides. We've got a charge against 2 ministers from Larbert, of all places, who they're on trial for illegal fishing and using unusual methods of fishing. And you've got to know what that is. You've just got to read that. So that's another half hour I lost in my research period following that line. But it followed on. This is a couple of days later. The main banner headline is for the Cuddies strip, but you can see again picking up on both cases at the same time. Then the Cuddies strip case, it lasted 6 days, and we had the judges summing up. And at the same time, there's this really odd headline here for the Ruxton case. And this just makes you wonder about so many different things. Remarkable scenes in Dr. Ruxton's house. A sightseer smashes a panel in a sealed room. So first of all, why is there a sightseer in a private building? Then secondly, why is there a sealed room? Why is there a panel? Why is the sightseer smashing the panel? There's just so many things that you want to ask about that. But this is the way that they looked at it at the time, and you can see there was a lot of information about it. It's not the kind of lurid headlines that we would get nowadays, but you can see there was a lot of coverage for it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Interesting seeing literally the 2 cases side by side in the newspapers, and even like linking the women involved in the cases somehow. I hadn't realized they'd done that. So that's really interesting. So there's clearly a lot of public and media interest in crime in general at the time, much like we have today. And Tom, why do you think that is?
Well, it's interesting. 1935 was right at the very peak of what we call the golden age of crime fiction. So you had Agatha Christie, you had Dashiell Hammett, you had Raymond Chandler, all selling millions of copies of books. And as Rob has said, the print media was at its absolute zenith. In England at that time, there were 5 newspapers that sold more than 1 million copies a day. And if you think about that now, and remember, no television and very little radio news. So if you wanted quality, in-depth news, you had to go to the newspapers. And they really did. As Rob has said, they covered these trials and they covered the investigations in minute detail. It was also a time, interestingly, of macabre interest in crime, ghoulishness. And this was linked to a great interest in spiritualism, which had come in after the First World War, after the huge casualties of the First World War. There was a huge number of spiritualists and people, mediums and people like that, trying to go back beyond the grave to speak to the victims of crime. And huge crowds flooded to crime scenes. I mean, the piece from the paper that Rob just read out about scenes at the Ruxton house were during an auction. And the auction was of the remaining furniture within the house, which had to be sold to pay for Dr. Ruxton's trial. But in both the Cuddies strip murder and the Ruxton murder, literally hundreds of people came to the crime scenes. And they did that because they fancied themselves, frankly, as being Hercule Poirot or Miss Marple. They wanted to actually become part of this investigation. Another thing they did was they used to go to the grave sites. And it was quite common then for the police to have to protect the grave sites of the victims from souvenir hunters and people who wanted to visit them. Now, remember, transport wasn't easy at that time. So these people sometimes had made their way over, long journeys on old buses and things to get to these places. There's a bizarre setup at the Ruxin thing. Immediately after the bodies were found, people started to appear. It's a very remote spot. People started to appear. And in the weeks later, cars and motor buses would come down from Edinburgh and Glasgow to near Muffet, where the body parts were found. And families would have picnics on the moor, and then they would go out looking for body parts. And literally, that passed for family entertainment. And of course, if they found an old leg of a sheep or something like that, they would proudly go back to the police station for their 5 minutes of fame. So it's interesting because when you look at some of the things they did then, it's not so much how different they are to today, but how similar they are. Now, what we do is we lay shrines of flowers. Following the death of Lady Diana, we go along to crime scenes and lay shrines of flowers. In these days, they wanted to be part of that investigation. So it was a unique confluence of all sorts of factors coming together to make 1935 a sort of febrile time of interest in crime. The more bloody, the more gruesome, the better.
Oh, thank you. So from what you're saying, the 1930s started to see real changes in policing in Scotland. And Rob, I think that played quite a part in Cuddies strip as well, didn't it?
Yeah, it did. As Tom said, it was a pivotal time, really, in policing and the way that policing was managed in Scotland. At that time in Perth, there were actually 2 police forces. So there was the Perth City Police, who were based in Tay Street, and there was also the Perthshire County Force, who were based in South Street in Perth, but covered the whole of Perthshire except for Perth. And actually, on the night of the crime, it was the city police who were first on the scene, but the Cuddies strip was outside their jurisdiction, only just. It was just outside the boundaries of the city. So the case had to be transferred over to the county police. So you just had that unnecessary delay. And really, the forces were too small. The Perthshire force only had 5 inspectors to cover the whole of Perthshire. And Perthshire is enormous. It's called the Big County. It's an enormous place, and they had 5 inspectors. And you could see really the same thing at that time throughout the whole of Scotland. At the turn of that century, in 1900, there were 69 different police forces in Scotland. By 1939, so a few years after our cases, That had gone down to 48, but that's still an awful lot of police forces. And it gradually went down. There were 20 in the 60s. We had the major local government reorganisation in 1975, and then it became the 8 regional authorities. Now, of course, we've got one, it's Police Scotland, and people are arguing, has that gone too far, and is it democratically accountable? But what we can certainly see was in the 1930s, with nearly 50 authorities, they were really only set up to keep the peace and not really that much else. Detection was never going to be something some of the smaller authorities were going to be very good at. In Perthshire, the highest ranking CID officer on the force was a sergeant. And for that reason, in the case, the Home Office intervened after 1 week, and they brought in some officers from Glasgow. Thomas said it was a febrile time. It really was. There was a national government in place at the time. There was a general election looming. They knew there would be a general election within weeks or months. It actually happened in November, but there was a lot of tension. And I think the Home Office were worried that if there was any delay in solving this crime, it could cause a lot of unrest in Perth. So they brought in Glasgow City Police to help them. And Chief Constable Percy Sillitoe and Assistant Chief Constable Warnock from Glasgow City Police came up and did a press conference in Perth. And what they did was they lent 2 police officers to work with the Perth Police on this case, the Perthshire Police on this case. And in addition to that, they provided fingerprint support from an officer called Bertie Hammond. Now, Tom will know the name Bertie Hammond very well because he was also involved in the Ruxton case. And he's probably one of the most important figures in the history of forensic fingerprinting. So in the Cuddies strip case, although the culprit was actually apprehended through a different piece of detective work, and actually an excellent piece of detective work, I think it's fair to say that it was Bertie Hammond's fingerprint evidence that was crucial in securing the conviction. So I think there were changes in the approach to policing happening in Scotland, and I think it did impact in the case. So just before we move on, Sarah, I'd just like to ask Tom a question, sort of following on from this. Sillitoe and Warnock, they came up to Perth and they offered support, and they actually lent the Perthshire force some experienced officers, which seems a very generous thing for them to do because they must have had their own priorities. But actually, I think this was quite a common thing.
Well, that's right. I mean, Percy Sillitoe was a visionary. I mean, you speak about Bertie Hammond's contribution to forensic detection, and you're absolutely right about that. Percy Sillitoe was the first real modern police chief in Scotland. And he was a gangbuster. I mean, that was where he got his reputation. But he also was a champion of what he called scientific methods, fingerprinting, crime scene photography, crime scene management. But what he wanted to do was not only improve his force of Glasgow City Police, he also wanted to spread the gospel. And so whenever he could, he would lend his officers out to the smaller county areas so that they could learn and they would follow his example. And he didn't charge for this. I mean, he contributed huge, significant resources to the Ruxin murders and charged not a penny. Because as far as he was concerned, he was spreading this doctrine of scientific methods. And it worked. It worked because such was the prestige of the Ruxton case that following on from that, all forces, even the smaller forces, even the Perths and the Perth counties, had to provide proper detective training, had to provide fingerprint services, had to follow on. And so what Sillitoe would frequently do was he would send out some of his top men, Willie Ewing, Bertie Hammond, Warnock was his Assistant Chief Constable Crime, a real formidable operator. They would send them out to help the small forces and convince the small forces to follow in their path.
Thank you, that's really interesting. So we can certainly see there were major improvements in policing in the 1930s. But Rob, if I can ask you, what was crime like then?
It was quite a difficult period. On Sillitoe and Warnock, I think one of the reasons they were brought into Glasgow in the first place was because of the level of crime in Glasgow at that time. The 20s and 30s, Glasgow was notorious for its razor gangs, much in the way we've got knife crime in London these days. It was razor gangs in Glasgow. And partly they were just street gangs, partly it was organised crime, partly it was sectarianism and religious bigotry. But Percy Sillitoe had experience of that kind of work in Sheffield, where he worked before, and that's why they brought him in. And so a lot of what Tom's talked about, the sort of the scientific, professionalized approach to policing, he brought. He also brought in a lot of big burly Highlanders who had no fear and would brook no argument. So I think there was a mixture of brain and brawn went on in terms of managing the crime, and it was clearly very successful. And he's an extremely important figure in police history. But the context of all of this, and I think this might answer one of the questions I've just seen pop up in the Q&A. The context is the period that we were in. So we had the crash in 1929, and through the 20s and into the 30s, there was a severe depression worldwide. It was the whole world, not just Britain, but it was particularly bad here. And obviously industry was affected, so Glasgow was badly hit by it. But rural areas as well, like Perthshire, so a lot of farm workers were laid off. And you had unemployment rates, well, around about 25%, 1 in 4 of the population were unemployed. And it was just a struggle for people to make ends meet. It was a really grim time. And the political and the social climate was growing worse as well. So we had, and this is when I get to the point of the question in the Q&A about the rise of fascism. We had the rise throughout Europe of extreme nationalism. In Nazi Germany, Hitler had come to power in 1933, so it's 2 years on. We didn't realize quite what the evil of that regime was going to be at this point, but there were lots of early indicators. Spain was in the middle of its civil war, which would lead to Franco and his fascist dictatorship. Italy had been a fascist dictatorship under Mussolini for quite some years, and it was now stretching its might into Africa, where it invaded Abyssinia. So there was serious political unrest, and organisations like the British Union of Fascists, they were making their voice heard. So it was a really frightening time. And I do actually think that is another reason why there was this interest in crime, whether it's true crime, the cases we're talking about, or fictional crime, the golden age that Tom's pointed out. And so to that extent, I think, although the police forces in this period were developing rapidly, to a large extent, I think they were still playing catch up with crime and the ever increasing crime rates at that time.
That makes sense, yeah. And it's good to put it in the wider economic context at the time. And now, Tom, I think I'm right in saying that Ruxton was convicted of the murder of his wife, Bella, but not of the servant girl, Mary Rogerson. So why do you think that was?
Yeah, just before I answer that question, just to follow in from Rob says that when you look at the structure of police forces in the 1930s, a lot of them were basically Victorian. And I mean that the people leading them were Victorian. Some chief constables at that time were appointed by the sort of local squirearchy and were in post for 30 years. So they were literally people of the 19th century. And to be honest with you, looking at the structure and the numbers and the budgets and the finance that they had, I wonder that they solved anything, quite honestly. They really were. I mean, when you look at it now, it's horrifying. The big city forces were getting on their feet and becoming more professional with people like Sillitoe. But in the county areas, it was one man and a dog, and sometimes there wasn't even a dog. But coming back to your question, yes, Buck Ruxton was eventually convicted of the murder of Bella, his wife, his common law wife, but he was not charged eventually with the murder of his servant girl, Mary, even though there was just as much evidence to charge him with the murder of Mary as there was for his wife. The reason given was that with Bella, there was evidence of previous domestic violence, and so you had a motive for the murder, and you didn't have that with Mary. But actually, I think it was much more simple than that. The trial had been very, very expensive and very, very lengthy. It was, at the time when it finished, it was the longest criminal trial in British criminal history at that time. So it cost a huge amount of money. And they said, well, you know, what about Mary now? And the response was, well, you can't hang a man twice. The truth is that Mary, being a servant girl, was not considered all that important. And while there were, I don't think there was a gender bias in the investigation of the Ruxton case, I think there was a class bias. The way that Mary Rogerson and her family were treated was very, very offhand. They were treated as being simple souls, unimportant. And poor Mary, because no one was convicted of her murder, the ghouls and the spiritualists and all these people that I've discussed just previously, they had a field day. I mean, the amount of trolling of Mary's family was appalling. Even 5 years after her death, they couldn't put up a monument to her in the churchyard for fear of people coming to the church to see her grave. And in Blackpool, which is very near the scene of the crime, there were still end of the pier shows in 1939 showing the murder scenes, the weapons, the bed that Isabella was killed on, all completely fake news, none of it real. But that just shows you the appalling treatment that Mary Rogerson and her family and anybody connected with the case was shown after the event. But so I think it was a class decision, and it was just to save money. And Mary was a previous servant girl, so who cares? I think that basically that was it.
Even I think in the photographs, they were much more able to fit the X-ray of Bella's body just because they had much better photographs of her. So even unconsciously, the class difference was just there. They didn't have the clear photographs of Mary that they could use to help identify the bodies, did they?
That's right. I mean, servant girls didn't have their photographs taken. It was as simple as that. However, in a funny sort of way, it worked the other way too, because Mary had very, very few possessions. And when Bertie Hammond, the fingerprint expert, got hold of them, he very, very quickly identified fingerprints from the body, which was later identified as Mary's, with the few pitiful possessions that Mary had. And I mean, she had there was a plate and there was a cup and she had a hairbrush and she had a couple of dresses. She had one pair of shoes, and that was it. And we forget that almost within living memory in Britain, we had this massive underclass of servants, which no longer exists now. Tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of servants who worked away and beavered away to keep these big houses going, but who were treated with frankly just contempt.
Yeah, definitely. And Rob, class was a factor in Cuddy Strip as well, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it was to an extent. What Marjorie Fenwick went through, I think, is something that we would find intolerable today. And I think it was probably partly to do with class. She was just an ordinary working girl. She worked in a sweet factory. And the judge at the trial, Lord Aitchison, he's quite a famous figure, and he was the first Labour Solicitor General in the country, and he was supposed to be the friend of the common person. But in the trial, he showed the jury a pendant, a necklace, or the remains of it that belonged to Marjorie. And what he said was, well, this is a poor thing. It's a piece of glass, no doubt. But it was a piece of jewelry she wore, and I've no doubt she was quite pleased to wear it. And it's just, it's just utterly patronizing. And it's clearly kind of class influenced as well. But I also think it's sexist too. I think it's just saying, well, there's a little girl, bless her, with her little fake jewelry, and I do think there was something in that in there. But I think we have to understand this was a mindset in those days. Women were not considered equal in any way. They weren't equal. They were the fair sex, and they didn't get the same opportunities in life. I'll just quickly share my screen again for one final bit. Right. So this is something that was actually produced by the Met Police, but around in the same period, and you know it's just extraordinary. Hefty girls wanted for the police force, and we've got so the prospects are good, but they must never marry or their careers will end! Exclamation mark. And actually in Scotland, this went on until 1968. Until 1968, if there was a woman police officer who married, she had to resign her commission. So this was the way they were treated and considered at the time. And you can see at the bottom, they must be hefty enough to withstand a rough and tumble, and they must be fairly good looking. So obviously they're not setting their sights too high on that score. And you know we can laugh at that because it's just so quaint and old-fashioned. But it is also serious, I think, because the issue of gender equality is important, and it definitely affected the way Marjorie was treated in court. All the way through the investigation, basically from the first night, she was questioned about what she was like and whether or not she was a virgin at the time of the crime, which is completely and utterly irrelevant, but it became a major part of the investigation and the trial. And she said she was a virgin, but the authorities, on no particular evidence, continued to doubt that. And it became an element of the trial. And in the trial, Lord Chief Justice Aitchison, he said, clearly this girl has made serious mistakes in her life. And he told the jury, therefore, you must consider whether this affects the reliability of her testimony. So Marjorie Fenwick was an innocent young woman, but she was effectively treated as a guilty party throughout a lot of the investigation and in the court, and her testimony was doubted and her reputation was tarnished. And you look at it, is it that much better now? And I'm not entirely convinced it is. I think there's still a real debate to be had about the way women are treated in the justice system. If you look at sex workers in particular, look at works like Denise Minor's The Less Dead, which is based in Glasgow in the 80s and 90s. And The Less Dead were a group of sex workers, street workers who were killed, but they were less dead because they were less important. There was just that perception, well, it didn't matter as much. And if you go back to things like the Yorkshire Ripper case, at first they assumed Peter Sutcliffe was only interested in prostitutes, and there was uproar when they started to think, well, it was decent women were being attacked. And so at the trial there, we had Michael Havers, he was the Attorney General, and he said something along the lines of, the sadness of this case is that some of these victims were respectable ladies. And the corollary of that is, well, those other ones who are sex workers, does it matter about them? So we need to look at that. And we know also in rape trials in this country, and the prosecution rate for that is astonishingly low. It's something like 1 in 30 will end in a prosecution. Women are still subject throughout that process to questions and suspicion, and it's all of those questions you get asked. Were they asking for it? Were they drunk? Were they wearing short dresses? Essentially trying to look to blame these innocent people for crimes committed by somebody else. So in this case, going back to Cuddies strip, yeah, I think class was an element to some extent, but I do think gender was more significant, and probably that's something that the whole legal system still has to learn in this day.
Yeah. So you think there was an element of misogyny in the investigation of the Cuddies strip crimes, would you say?
There was, I think, yeah. It's probably not as much as in those other cases I mentioned in Glasgow or the Yorkshire Ripper. But I think you just have to understand and accept there was a deeply patronising and belittling view of women back in that period. And those views were second nature. They were utterly entrenched in society. They weren't questioned. That was the received wisdom. And I think all you can say really is the 1930s in Britain was not an easy place in which to be a woman. It was a very, very male-dominated world.
Definitely, definitely. And Tom, do you think there's anything we can learn from that today?
Well, I think things have moved on a great deal. I mean, I remember when I joined the police service, women officers had to stand down and had to retire before the Sex Discrimination Act of 1974 or 73, I think. And so much has changed from that. But to come to it's interesting to talk about what I would describe as worthy and unworthy victims. And having been involved in quite a number of murder investigations myself, it's interesting because one of the last ones I was involved in was the murder of a local criminal. He was a gangster, a very unpopular, very violent person who just so happened to meet someone who was even more violent than he was. And he ended up dead. And we had a terrible job investigating that murder because nobody was interested. And when you spoke to people who lived in the area, what they told you was he had it coming and they weren't interested. Now counter that with a few years before that, I'd been involved in a couple of very protracted child murder investigations where we were inundated with information, sometimes too much information. It almost flooded our systems out. And we weren't working on the old card systems that there were. We had the computerized system. So you get this tremendous view from the general population about worthy and unworthy victims. But coming back to Rob's point about rape and sexual offences, I was involved in investigation of that for many, many years. And I came to the conclusion that one of the big problems is that we are trying to work in the 21st century with basically a 19th century legal system. Because the last time that sexual offences were really looked at and codified in statute was 1884, the Criminal Law Amendment Act. So we're working within the definitions as laid down in 1884 for the 21st century. And I think in Scotland and in the UK, we've actually got to bite the bullet and follow some of the continental examples, in Scandinavia in particular, and actually look at the code of sexual offences. And that's the only way we're going to get more convictions. Because unfortunately, having investigated these things, regardless of your emotions and your feeling, you still have to search for evidence. And you have to ask hard questions, and you have to seek out forensic evidence because you have to put the facts before the court. And until we look again at this Victorian legal system, or this aspect of our legal system, which is Victorian, we'll actually never make much improvement. But of course, if you try to do that, then you're immediately accused of trying to dilute the offences, etc., etc. And I just think that's a basic misunderstanding, because if you want to increase conviction rate, and I think we should, and we could, then we have to look again at definitions and the legal code round about sexual offences.
Thank you for putting that into like the wider context for us, the legal context as well. And now, unless either of you have any more points to add, we have lots of questions coming through now on the Zoom, and I think we might have a comment or two on Facebook as well. So maybe Bianca, you could read some of them out for us now.
Yeah, sure. Well, John asks, why did you feel so strongly that you wanted to write about these crimes?
Well, I'll go first. Because I felt that many people who had played such a primary role had been airbrushed out of history. And I really did feel a responsibility to draw them back into the light. For instance, one of Rob's excellent press cuttings there showed Sergeant Bob Sloan of Dumfriesshire Constabulary. Now, if you Google the Ruxton case, you'll see all about the forensic, you'll see about fingerprinting, you'll see about facial superimposition, and you will not see much about the absolutely amazing work that man did at that crime scene. And I have to say that, Rob, I think if you'd had a Bob Sloan in Perth at Cuddies Strip, I think the investigation would have turned out differently. And I wanted very much to bring him out of the shadows and to show the world just what a fine man he was. And interestingly, I was contacted by his grandson just after the book was published, who thanked me because he knew nothing about his grandfather's actions at that time. And I mean, you know, that for me was reward enough for writing the book. And that's the reason I wanted to write it.
Oh, you're muted, Rob.
So first time I've done that today. I usually do that several times a day at work. Yeah. I mean, what struck me from the contemporary reports when I was first researching it was the way that Marjorie was treated. And then when I looked at some of the materials in the court records, in the National Records of Scotland, that just made it even more stark for me. Some of the medical examinations that went on, it just struck me that the way she was treated was simply disgraceful. And there was this basic supposition on the basis of no evidence whatsoever that she might not be a reliable witness. I think she was an entirely reliable witness, but she was put through a terrible ordeal. In fact, she was put through several terrible ordeals in the course of the 3 months or so from the crime to the prosecution. And what I wanted to do was just put Marjorie's point of view across, because I just think she deserved better than she got at the time.
Yes, so Patricia O'Hara asks, how long did it take to write your books? How much was research and how long writing?
Well, I'll go first. Well, I had a whole lot of papers, confidential papers. And so I thought, well, you know, I've got these and it shouldn't take too long. It took me a year. And I had to send for documents from as far away as South Africa. And I ended up with something like 500,000 words, which I then had to boil down to, you know, the 100,000 that you require for it. So it took me a long time because there was so much information out there, which I had to gather in. And I was very conscious that I had to get it right, absolutely right, because I was talking about real people and I was talking about using the real names. And while none of them would be alive, they would have families, etc., etc. So I really was very particular about getting accuracy within it. And it took me a year to research and about 9 months to write. And that's despite having a flying start with all the confidential police documents. So it takes quite a long time.
Yeah, and for me, I spent probably about 3 months doing all the initial research, and then I started writing the main draft. That took me about 16 weeks, so 4 months thereabouts. I finished that at Christmas 2017. I usually finish things at Christmas because I get 2 weeks off then, so I've got plenty of time to do it. So I finished that then. Then I worked on the second draft. That took another 15, 16 weeks. So all in all, it probably took me about a year to write this one. And it was the second novel I'd written. I'd written one before that, and that one actually took me probably between 2 and 3 years because I hadn't the faintest idea what I was doing. I was making it up as I went along. So clearly, I'm getting a bit better at it as we go along.
So this question is addressed to Tom. Tom, you draw your officer characters so deftly. How much is fact and how much your own sensitivity?
Well, I suppose I have the advantage is in that I can put myself in these people's shoes and appreciate their feelings and their strengths and weaknesses. But I also had the advantage in that I had their personal statements. I had all the documents where they had recorded at the time. I even had the crime scene sketches. I had the notebooks that Bob Sloan made up on the night. So I had a real intimate insight into what they were thinking and what they were doing at the time. But I suppose in terms of interpretation, of course, there's something of you in that, and Rob will be the same. There's something of Rob in his book and there's something of me in this. And I think my own long police service, mostly spent in criminal investigation, I suppose I could put myself more readily in their shoes and appreciate the mistakes and the funny parts and all the other things that happen along the way.
Then it sounds like it could be emotionally challenging to write about these crimes. Does this influence Rob's thoughts on writing about crime in the future?
Rob, do you want to go first?
Yeah, it was challenging writing this one because there was a lot of emotional stuff going on in it. but I found it very rewarding doing that. And I do think that is the kind of thing I will continue to do. I've just finished writing my second novel, and there's a lot of things, emotional things going on in that novel as well. Not the same sort of stuff, but with a similar sort of trying to dig under the veneer of society and dig into what things were really like, what it was like to live then, and to be not part of the elite, but be under suspicion all the time. And so, yeah, I think that's probably something it's probably always informed my style of writing, kind of my subject matter. So yeah, I think I'll carry on with that kind of approach.
Mm-hmm. I would say that after I left the police service, I did 2 or 3 years of doing cold case reviews in the north of England, and I found them very, very interesting because you were on your own, but it allowed you to take a modern view, a view from the sort of somewhere on a raised plane of investigations that had taken place many years before, some good, some bad, and some indifferent. And I really enjoyed that process, that sort of forensic process. And I suppose this is what I did in Ruxton. Emotional, yes, of course you do. You get tied in because you know the characters. And Mary Rogerson, in my case, I felt heart sorry for that girl and for her family. I really did at the end. And I even went down to the church where she's buried and tried to find her grave. And a local man directed me to it, still unmarked. Because they don't want to attract people to the scene, or they didn't. But I suppose overwhelmingly, what I felt was a sense of responsibility to tell the story and to get it right. And as I say, to rehabilitate these lost heroes and to give credit to people who have been remembered for the wrong things. I mean, Percy Sillitoe, who we've both discussed, one of the most important, if not the most important person in Scottish policing history, is remembered mainly now for developing and inventing the black and white checkered band around your hat, around police hats. If you look at Percy Sillitoe, he's credited with this. He was responsible for so much more than that, and he deserves to be remembered for a lot more than a black and white checkered band. So again, that's I found that rewarding and interesting.
So another question is, who is your favorite crime author from the 1930s? Rob, you want to go first?
Favorite crime writer from the 1930s?
Yeah.
I would say I read quite a lot of stuff from the golden age. I read quite a lot of hard-boiled stuff from America, so things like Nero Wolfe. And I read Miss Marple, and I liked that, but I couldn't stand that bloody Poirot. Hated him. I read a lot of Dorothy L. Sayers, but I got defeated by the Nine Tailors. Well, all of those triple Bob Majors and grandsires and plain Bobs and stuff like that. It was just, if it'd been 150 pages shorter, it would have been a great novel. But the one I would choose from that period would be John Dixon Carr, and especially when he wrote as Carter Dixon. He was such a prolific author. He produced about 4 books a year, and his publishers told him to slow down, and he had to use lots of different names. And he wrote under Carter Dixon with a character called Sir Henry Merivale. And Sir Henry Merivale he's a real larger-than-life character. He's really loud, he's really rude, bad-tempered, but jolly and very funny as well. And he was a barrister, but he was also a doctor, and he was also a stage magician. So obviously he had all of the skills that you would need to manage crime and as a gentleman sleuth in the 1930s. And what John Dixon Carr and Carter Dixon did particularly was locked room mysteries. They were absolutely brilliant at doing those. And I liked those, but what I found really most about those books was they had an incredible sense of place and a sense of menace in them. There's one of them that's set in, it's in a condemned cell of a disused prison. And that book is quite extra. Actually, I've probably got a copy of it somewhere. It's one of these two. I can't remember which one it is, but it's either that one, Night at the Mockingbird, or that one, The Skeleton in the clock. It's one of these two. And I swear, when I read that book, I could smell the decaying flesh as I was reading the words. It was just extraordinary. And he's probably a bit dated now, because it was from the 1930s, but he was an absolutely brilliant writer.
I think I wouldn't disagree with Rob, but I think when you stand back from it, you've got to hand it to Agatha Christie. I mean, her plot development and everything else, and the proof of the pudding is in longevity. And if you look at the people who have influenced crime writing, you look at Conan Doyle, and then you look at Agatha Christie. And if you turn on the television tonight, you will find an Agatha Christie play or film. She has the longest running play in the West End ever in the whole wide world. Her books are all still in print, and it's amazing the number of people who still ape her and who copy her. And some of her stuff's very dated, and yes, I found Poirot incredibly annoying as well. But of course, he was just a literary device. But I think there's no question in terms of influence of the reading and particularly crime writing in this country, Agatha Christie has to take it.
So you both talk very passionately about representing the victim of these crimes. Are you working on more true crimes next or something else?
For me, yes, I am working just now on a history of the sex industry in Scotland. And Rob mentioned earlier on about unworthy victims and unsolved murders of sex workers, and he's absolutely right. The way that these women and some men have been treated in past years has been absolutely disgraceful. And it's fascinating. And I'm going way back to about 1780, 1840 in Edinburgh. The tremendous effect that venereal disease, particularly syphilis, had upon the whole of society, and then on up through the 50s and 60s. So I'm doing that just now. I have to say I found it very difficult writing in this period of lockdown. I write a column for a newspaper as well, and I've found that not so difficult. But in terms of research and really digging in and writing, I found this period of lockdown and this sort of period of discombobulating, if you like, extremely difficult. But that's what I'm doing at the moment.
Yeah, and as I said, I've just finished my follow-up to Cuddies strip, which is called Barossa Street. Barossa Street's a street in Perth. It's where I used to park my car every day when I worked in the Sandyman Library in Perth. And it's also got the supporters club for St Johnstone Football Club, who are my team, who are playing in the Scottish Cup final on Saturday. So I'm very nervous about that. But yeah, I've been working on Barossa Street. It does have a real crime in it. It's not a crime that happened in Perth. It's one that I filched from somewhere else from that period, just so that I could get some of the sort of the police investigatory stuff right. So that's what I've been working on this last year, and hopefully that'll come out later on this year.
Okay, so Jill says, I joined the police force in the mid-1970s, just after the police women's debt was disbanded, and we worked on the shifts alongside the male officers. We were very poorly regarded by many of the men. If you have seen the TV series Life on Mars, then that was my experience as a female officer. Thankfully, it did improve. Do you want to comment it?
Yes, I think that's true. I remember that time as well, and you're absolutely right. And it took a long time. But I'm pleased to say now that when you look at Police Scotland, I think something like 40% of Police Scotland are women officers, and that's replicated through the ranks. So 40% of first-line supervisors and senior officers and chief officers are also women, and that has, can I say, wholly improved the service. I remember it when it was a very male-dominated business, and I saw it change as I went through my service, and with the increased influence and presence of women officers, the quality of work that we did improved. It's been a huge advantage.
Well, I think that's the end of questions.
Perfect. Thanks for reading those out, Bianca. So if anyone watching would like to find out more about all the interesting events discussed tonight, you can buy both Ruxton and Cuddies strip from the Ringwood website, and I would really recommend both. And thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you very much, Tom and Rob, for all your amazing insights. And I hope you all enjoyed watching.
Thank you, Bianca, and thank you, Sarah, and thank you, everybody in the audience.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. That was really good. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
So thank you. Goodbye.
Thank
Goodbye.
you.
Bye.